The evening Harlan Voss stood in the doorway of the guest bedroom and told his wife to pack her things. He was wearing the same expression he used in board meetings, measured, detached, as if he were simply closing a line item on a quarterly report. Soren Voss, 37 years old, stood barefoot on the cold hardwood floor and looked at her husband of 9 years. She did not cry. She had already spent 3 years crying in the shower so no one would hear. Behind Harlan, his mother, Constance Voss, 61 years old and smelling of cedar and disapproval, stood with her arms folded. She did not come inside the room. She stayed in the doorway like she was supervising a move-out at a rental property. "You can take the suitcases in the hall closet," Constance said. "Leave the ones we gave you as a wedding gift." Soren looked at the closet. Then she looked at her husband. He looked at the window. That was the moment she understood the marriage had not ended tonight. It had ended years ago. Tonight was just the paperwork. She had met Harlan when she was 28 at a property auction in Charleston. She had been there representing her firm. He had been there with his father, Whitmore Voss, 70 years old at the time, who ran a mid-sized commercial real estate company called Voss Properties Group out of Charlotte. Harlan had been charming in that careful, rehearsed way that some men mistake for personality. He opened doors. He remembered how she took her coffee. He called when he said he would call. What he never asked, not once in 9 years, was what she did for a living. Not really. He asked once, on their second date, and when she said she worked in hospitality and property acquisition, he nodded the way people nod when they're not listening, and the subject moved on to his father's portfolio, his father's connections, his father's plans. She let it move on. She had learned by then that some men don't ask follow-up questions about women's careers because they've already decided the answer doesn't matter much. She was Soren Calloway before she became Soren Voss. She kept her professional name Soren Calloway in every document that didn't require her marriage certificate. Harlan found that eccentric. His mother found it suspicious. Soren found it practical. What none of them knew, what she had never volunteered, and no one had ever bothered to pursue, was that Soren Calloway was the majority shareholder and silent operating director of Calloway Meridian Group, a hospitality and commercial property conglomerate that owned 43 hotel properties across 11 states, 2 of which were in Charlotte. She had inherited the seed portfolio from her grandmother at 23, spent 6 years building it quietly. And by the time she met Harlan at that auction, her firm's annual revenue exceeded $300 million. She wore flat shoes to the auction. She drove a 4-year-old Volvo. She never corrected anyone who assumed she was support staff. The Voss family assumed she was support staff for 9 years. The first time Constance Voss called Soren the help, she said it to Harlan's aunt at a Christmas dinner, while Soren was standing 8 feet away refilling water glasses because she'd offered and the hired server had stepped out. Constance laughed afterward and said Soren had misheard. Soren had not misheard. She stayed because she loved Harlan. Or she loved who she believed Harlan was becoming. There is a particular kind of optimism that attaches itself to potential, and Soren had always been better at long-term strategy than she was at cutting losses early. The first year was good. The second year was quieter. By the third year, Harlan had started working late 3 nights a week, and by the 5th year those nights had a pattern that Soren recognized but did not yet name. She was running a company. She told herself she was too busy to read into things. That was not entirely honest. The woman's name was Farah. Harlan did not introduce them. Soren found out the way women often find out. Not through confrontation or confession, but through the accumulation of small things that individually mean nothing, and collectively mean everything. A receipt for a restaurant she'd never been to. A hotel key card in a jacket pocket she'd pulled from the dry cleaning pile. A text preview she wasn't trying to read. She hired a private investigator. She spent 14 days confirming what she already knew. Then she put the report in a folder in her home office and went back to work. She had not decided yet what to do with it. What she had not anticipated was that Harlan would decide first. Whitmore Voss, Harlan's father, had spent the last 2 years quietly overextending Voss Properties Group. He had taken on 3 major commercial developments simultaneously, financed with a combination of bank debt and private credit, and the rental market absorption had come in slower than his projections. By the fall of that year, the company was carrying debt it could not service on its current cash flow. Whitmore needed a capital infusion, a refinancing package, or a buyer for at least one of the distressed assets. What Whitmore did not know was that 2 of those distressed assets, a mixed-use development on Tryon Street and a hotel conversion project on South Boulevard, had been financed in part through a subsidiary credit facility that traced back through 2 holding entities to Calloway Meridian Group. Soren had not engineered this. She had approved the credit extension 18 months earlier as a routine portfolio decision. She had not connected it to her husband's family because at the time she had not known the Voss family's subsidiary structure well enough to trace it. Her finance team had flagged it 6 weeks ago. She had read the memo twice and sat with it for a long time before saying anything. She had not yet said anything to Harlan. The night Harlan told her to pack her things, he had a folder of his own, divorce papers, drafted by a firm in uptown Charlotte. He set them on the bed beside her. He said he thought it was better this way. He said they had grown apart. He'd said all the things say when they have decided the explanation matters less than the exit. He did not mention Farah. Constance appeared in the doorway 2 minutes into the conversation, which told Soren that Constance had not wandered in accidentally. This had been coordinated. The mother had probably been in the hall the entire time. "It's for the best," Constance said. "You two were never really suited." Soren looked at the papers. She looked at her husband. She looked at his mother. She picked up the folder, carried it to the kitchen, set it on the counter, and poured herself a glass of water. She stood at the kitchen window for 3 minutes. Then she went back to the bedroom, took the 2 suitcases that had always been hers, and began to pack. She did not sign anything that night. She moved into one of her own hotels. The general manager, a woman named Dale, who had worked for Callaway Meridian for 11 years, gave her the corner suite on the 14th floor and asked no questions. Soren appreciated that more than she could say. She called her attorney the next morning. Not a divorce attorney. Her corporate attorney, a man named Harvis, who had been with her since the company was 3 hotels and a spreadsheet. She told him about the Tryon Street credit facility. She told him about the South Boulevard conversion loan. She told him that the borrower entity had ties to Voss Properties Group and that she was now in a period of personal legal separation from a member of the Voss family. Harvis was quiet for a moment. "Does Voss Properties know who holds the credit?" he asked. "No," Soren said. "The facility is held through Meridian Capital Partners. They wouldn't have connected it." Another pause. "Do you want to accelerate the review?" he asked. She thought about the folder of divorce papers on the kitchen counter. She thought about Constance in the doorway. She thought about the woman named Farah, whose name she had never said out loud. "Schedule a standard covenant review," she said. "By the book, nothing accelerated, nothing delayed. Just run the process the way we always run it." Harvis said he understood. The covenant review took 4 weeks. What it found was not surprising to anyone who had been paying attention to Voss Properties' financials, and Soren had, quietly, for several months. The Tryon Street development was behind on 2 interest payments. The South Boulevard conversion had missed a construction milestone that triggered a performance clause. Under the terms of the credit agreements, Meridian Capital Partners had grounds to issue a notice of default. Harvis called her when the report came through. "Standard process," she said again. "Understood," he said. The notice of default went out on a Tuesday. Whitmore Voss received it at his office in Charlotte. His chief financial officer received a copy simultaneously. It came from Meridian Capital Partners, a name that meant nothing to Whitmore. A name he would have to research, and when he researched it, he would find that it was a wholly owned subsidiary of Callaway Meridian Group. He researched it on Thursday. Soren was in a meeting when her assistant slipped her a note that said Whitmore Voss had called 4 times. She finished the meeting. She called him back at 4:30. He did not waste time. "Is this a coincidence?" he asked. His voice was controlled, but there was something underneath it that sounded like the beginning of vertigo. "The credit review is a standard process," Soren said. "The covenant breach is documented." "You're Soren Voss," he said. "You're my son's wife." "I'm Soren Callaway," she said. "I've always been Soren Callaway. The name is on every document." There was a long silence. "Harlan didn't know," Whitmore said. "It was somewhere between a question and a statement and an accusation." "That's something you'd have to ask Harlan," she said. She did not say. "I tried to tell him who I was on our 4th date, and he talked over me to explain commercial cap rates." She did not say. "Your wife called me the help at your Christmas dinner, and your son said I'd misheard." She did not say any of it, because none of it was relevant to the covenant review, and because some things don't need to be said to be heard. Harlan called that evening. He called from a number she didn't recognize, which meant he had used Farah's phone, which told her something about where he was and what kind of evening he'd been having before his father called him. "Why didn't you tell me?" he said. She thought about the question for a moment. It was, in a strange way, the most honest thing he had said to her in years. Not angry, not accusatory, genuinely baffled. He truly did not understand how it had happened, which meant he had not once, in 9 years, sat across from her and thought, "I wonder what she actually does. I wonder what her firm actually is. I wonder if I know this person." "You never asked," she said. He was quiet. "Harlan," she said, "you handed me divorce papers. Your mother supervised. I packed my own suitcases. Whatever conversation you think we need to have right now, I'm not the right person to have it with. She ended the call. The next 2 weeks moved the way corporate processes move, steadily, without drama, according to schedules and documentation. The Meridian Capital Partners notice triggered a review by Voss Properties' primary lender, a regional bank that had its own covenant concerns. The bank issued its own inquiry. The CFO of Voss Properties sent 2 emails to Soren's office requesting a restructuring conversation. Soren's team responded within standard timelines, professionally, with no special accommodation and no obstruction. She was not trying to destroy Voss Properties, she was running a company. But the thing about running a company is that the company does not pause for personal circumstances. The covenants were breached. The review was legitimate. The outcomes that followed were the natural outcomes of decisions that Whitmore Voss had made over 2 years, decisions that had nothing to do with Soren and everything to do with overextension and optimism and a man who had confused momentum with stability. Constance called once. Soren did not answer. Constance left a voicemail that was 3 minutes and 40 seconds long and could be summarized as, "We didn't know, we're sorry, please help us." Listened to it twice and forwarded it to Harvis without comment. There was one afternoon, about 3 weeks after the default notice, when Soren drove past the South Boulevard conversion site. She parked across the street and looked at it for a few minutes through the windshield. It was a good building, actually. Good bones. The conversion plan had real potential if it had been capitalized properly and given 18 more months. She called Dale that afternoon and asked her to pull the site file. She was not doing this for the Voss family. She was doing it because it was a good building, and she ran a hospitality company, and that was the kind of decision she made. The restructuring that Meridian Capital Partners eventually offered on the South Boulevard property included a full buyout of the debt at a discount and a management contract with Callaway Meridian. Voss Properties would retain a nominal equity position. It was by any measure a better outcome than a forced sale at distressed prices. Harvis called it generous. Soren called it a portfolio decision. Whitmore accepted on a Friday afternoon. His attorney sent a brief note of thanks. Soren's office replied with the standard acknowledgement. The Tryon Street development was handled differently. Meridian Capital Partners sold its position to a third-party buyer at market. Voss Properties lost the asset. That one was not personal either. The numbers simply hadn't supported keeping it. The divorce was finalized in the spring. Soren signed the papers in Harvis's office on a Tuesday morning quietly, without ceremony. The settlement was straightforward. She had a prenuptial agreement, which she had brought to the marriage, and which Harlan had signed without reading closely because he had assumed, they had all assumed, that it existed to protect the Voss family's assets. It had, in fact, been drafted by Harvis to protect hers. She walked out of Harvis's office at 11:15 in the morning and stood on the sidewalk in the late March sun for a moment. The city was doing what cities do in early spring, that tentative loosening, that sense of held breath releasing. A woman walked past with a coffee. A cab honked somewhere. Everything was ordinary and entirely fine. She had a 2 o'clock call with her acquisitions team about a property in Nashville. She had dinner with Dale that evening at a restaurant they both liked, where they always ordered the same things and talked about work and occasionally about everything else. She had 3 days of site visits scheduled for the following week in Atlanta. She had a company to run. She had always had a company to run. What she did not have anymore was a man standing in a doorway looking at a window while his mother supervised her removal from a home she had never really been allowed to inhabit fully. She had not realized, until that was gone, how much space it had occupied. Not the marriage exactly, but the particular exhaustion of being underestimated by people who were supposed to know her. She did not miss Harlan. She was surprised, and then not surprised, to discover that what she missed was the idea she had held for 9 years that she was wrong about him. That idea had taken up a great deal of energy to maintain. Months later, a mutual acquaintance mentioned in passing that Harlan had opened a new venture, a small commercial real estate consulting firm, just himself and 2 partners. The acquaintance said it with a kind of careful neutrality that suggested he was watching to see how Soren would react. "I hope it goes well for him," she said, and she meant it. Not warmly, not coldly. She meant it the way you mean things that are true and no longer relevant. The acquaintance nodded and moved on to other subjects. She flew to Nashville the next morning for the acquisition review. The property was a converted warehouse near the Gulch. 12 floors, good light, solid mechanicals, undervalued by a seller who needed liquidity. She walked through it with her acquisitions director and a local broker, and she asked the questions she always asked. Load-bearing walls, HVAC age, what the neighborhood looked like at 7 in the morning versus 7 at night. She stood at the top floor window for a moment and looked out over the city. She had started with 3 properties and a spreadsheet. She had built the rest without asking anyone's permission, without waiting for anyone to see her correctly, without needing anyone to know before she was ready. The broker said something about the asking price. She turned from the window and gave him her full attention. There was work to do.